February 2020, we had a policy change, and that meant that many of the studies that didn't qualify for exempt status now do, and a lot of those are classroom studies. And so the first question most often that we get is this exempt, and what are those categories? The second is who needs IRB training in regards to who's involved with the study. And the third most common question I think we get is, if I'm not publishing this, do I still need to go through the IRB? I think when you're doing SoTL research, there's a lot of those issues that in regards to, procedure is still relevant, but there's a lot of them when you get into the depths of the procedure that might be relevant. And I would just like to suggest, just put NA, not applicable. If it is applicable, we'll tell you it's applicable, but so much of it's not. And when it is exempt, a lot of those already get grayed out. So you won't have many of those NA situations, but definitely just put NA. Exempt is super quick. That's the great thing about exempt, and that's why people are so happy about that policy change. Exempt, 1 to 3-ish days. It does not go out to IRB members. And so that's why it generally doesn't take as long, and it's not as risky. If it's expedited, that's 5 to 7 days, depending on how many revisions you have. And if it's full board, depending on when your meeting is and depending on when you turned it in and your revisions, I would think it was somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks. In order to be exempt, I think the easiest way to answer that question is to just tell you the qualifications they need to be exempt. The first is that the risks to the subjects need to be minimized. Most of SoTL research, they are minimized because you're using class material or you're using data from the class and de-identified data. So there isn't really much risk there. The second qualification to be exempt is that risks are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. Because this is SoTL research is generally not a high risk situation, your benefits far outweigh your risks because there hardly are any, if any. Third, the selection of subjects needs to be equitable. Generally with SoTL research, you include your entire class unless they're under 18. And so selection isn't necessarily an issue there. Fourth, informed consent is obtained or appropriately waived for all prospective subjects. Unless you're doing interviews with your students, that consent will be waived. You won't have a consent because you're often looking at class material that they've submitted and things like that. And hence with exempt, you don't normally need that consent form. Next, the subject's privacy is protected and the confidentiality of data is maintained. As long as that their names are removed and everything's de-identified, you should be fine with exempt status. And then last, appropriate safeguards are incorporated for vulnerable subjects. All of this goes out the window when you are looking at protected populations, right? But generally, I can't think of any situation in SoTL research, unless you are on a reservation, that would be relevant. The first suggestion I have is to think worst case scenario and work backwards. So with SoTL research, it's relatively low risk, so you don't have many worst case scenarios, but a couple things that could happen is one, where your confidentiality is breached. So maybe you're using quotes from students, and the way that it's a small class, and so the way that they are describing things outs who it is that you're talking about, and you can block those words out, rewrite it in a way that it doesn't reveal who your students are. And so that would be one thing that you might need to think about. The other is if you have minors in your college classroom, you won't be able to include them. They would still be involved in the activity, but you just wouldn't be able to use their data. The second thing I would suggest is when in doubt, ask. We love questions. Both Cindy Morgan, Tammy Castle, and myself, we're tied to our emails from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. So we're very responsive and generally give you a quick answer. It's always better to ask versus ask for forgiveness later. The third thing I would suggest is keep an open mind in regards to design. We are on your side. We are not trying to ruin your study. It's very natural to be defensive about things when we come back with suggestions. We are not criticizing your design. We're simply there to protect participants' well-being. Yeah, I think you probably could do that. That would definitely go through IRB because it's more of an experiment. If you word it as an experiment, I think you would be fine. Sure. Yeah. If you're using the participant pool and you're not doing an intervention per se in your class and you're just asking everyone in the participant pool, and some of those people may be in your class, that is completely fine because there's multiple studies that they can choose from. So they are choosing. And so we're good there. The problem that we run into is when you are doing interventions in your classroom and you are obtaining consent from your students and it's the instructor that's going through that consent process. That can give an air of coercion for your participants and your students. So typically what we recommend is have someone else come in and do that consent process so that they feel okay to say no. It could be a grad student, it could be another faculty member, just so long as the person asking for the consent has zero control over their grades in that class. Same argument with the instructor shouldn't be doing the consent process. They could send it out on a question pro survey and have someone else send it out, right? Hey, we're doing this research. If we'd like to include your data, but we need you to read this consent form and agree to it. If you were to do verbal consent processes, my suggestion is always do question pro to have some kind of proof. But if you were to do it online via Zoom, you could record that portion where they are verbally consenting and do a verbal consent. But we have to have some kind of proof that they've consented if it's not exempt. My personal preference is always do it prior so that people aren't surprised, right? Although there are some situations where you didn't realize at the beginning of the semester that you were going to do these interventions or you wanted to collect data. At that point, you would need to grab consent after. However, if the class is over and you're simply using data from, say, Canvas or data from Zoom or data from, their assignments, that would be exempt as long as everything was de-identified. And so you wouldn't need consent in that process. No, it would be exempt, but you would still need to run it through IRB. It would be exempt. As long as they're de-identified, no. But that refers to my earlier example, make sure that nothing about them outs who they are. But yeah, absolutely exempt. It would still be exempt. You would just need to run it through IRB. It would be a little different because not everybody was getting the intervention, and so it works, but it's still confidential and everything's still de-identified and the risks are minimal, but it's classroom research, so it would still be exempt. Situations where it might not be exempt would be anytime you have a protected population in your class, right? Or you're specifically studying that protected population. So maybe you might go into a classroom setting in prisons, or you might be on a reservation somewhere, or you might, I mean, in any time you have, or minors, right? If you're in a K through 12 classroom situation, we see that a lot. That is definitely not exempt. Anytime where you have a situation where the risks are really high, and like I said, in SoTL research, I don't think I have ever seen a situation where the risks would be high. I literally cannot think of a situation where the risks would be really high in SoTL. Not necessarily, unless you were specifically putting people in different categories based on that and giving certain people more advantage than others based on those qualifications. So giving someone who might be of a certain a certain race, a different intervention because of that race, then we're taking it out of exempt. The thing is that you just want to be very open and transparent about everything that you're doing, to a nauseating level of detail. The first is, and I've said this before, when in doubt, ask. Please ask, please ask, please ask us questions. We really would rather you ask us rather than just go and do it and then come to us and find out later that you can't use your research and your data because something was done wrong. We hate those conversations. That does happen sometimes, and people get really angry. And we try to keep the anger levels down. The other suggestion I have is that when you have students that are doing research, please come to their IRB meetings if you end up at a full board meeting. You wouldn't necessarily for SoTL research, but I think in general that really helps students, but also helps the IRB board as well. And then the last is stay positive and open-minded. It's really easy to get defensive when those comments come back and you're trying to get your research done. And we understand that because we all do research as well. If you keep an open mind and be flexible, we'll get it done.